Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Amateur Radio Technician class, session number 14. During our previous session, we looked at where we were in the curriculum, mentioned the practice exams, then we covered the technical topics of transceivers, transverters, RF power amplifiers, then we dealt with sensitivity, also selectivity, and we went on to talk about preamplifiers, mixers, oscillators. We also discussed modulation, radio frequency interference, the concepts of fundamental overload, harmonics. Also, we delved into interference resolution. Then we discussed some instruments such as the multimeters, voltmeters, ohmmeters, ammeters, and we ended with what solder is. And of course, our usual question pool review. So our agenda for this evening, we will quickly look at where we are in the curriculum. We'll again mention the practice exams. We'll also talk about the technical topics, repeater stations, auxiliary stations, space stations, also automatic stations. Then we'll discuss what linked repeaters are, repeater offsets. Then we get into what CTCSS is. Then some features such as reverse function, what over deviation is. We'll then get into some operational items such as making contacts, simplex operations, radio operations, how to conduct test transmissions. We'll also discuss what Q signals are, also the concept of band plans. Then we go into emergency communications, then networks, and we will also talk about the phonetic alphabet. And then we go into talking a bit about formal traffic messages, also known as the radiogram. Then we get into satellite operations. We discuss the concept of Doppler shift, and that's where we'll end with the technical discussion, followed by our usual question pool review. And then we'll give the date of the next session. And also, we have some information on the upcoming exams in Trinidad and Tobago. So if we were to look at our curriculum, you see that we have progressed quite nicely. And we are commencing the topic operating procedures. We will not complete this evening. We just have a little bit more to go for operating procedures. And then last topic will be rules and regulations, but we technically have 2 more sessions, right? So this is session number 14. We did mention we'll do about 16 sessions, so we seem to be on track for that. As always, we remind all participants, never too early to take or try your hand at the practice exams. So by now you would have covered quite a bit of the course. So you should be looking at these exams and seeing where you are. Of course, the course text that we're using, the No Nonsense Technician Class License Study Guide. Right, so let's just pull it back a little bit and discuss again what we are aiming towards. So we have this slide that should look familiar to most participants. We said this is an example of an amateur radio station, an HF amateur radio station that we might be aiming for, where we have the electrical supply in our house. We have a power supply that converts that power 120 volts perhaps into DC power that our transceiver will require 13.8 volts. We'll have a microphone connected to that transceiver, and then maybe a jumper cable to an accessory device and an antenna tuner, and then feed line that goes outside to our tower in the yard and our very large array of antennas. So this may be what an HF amateur station looks like. When you become licensed, you're able to purchase, own this type of equipment and set it up. But this is not the only type. We've been showing this. So here's another slide. So this is mobile operation now. So we'll have a radio in our car, maybe a dual band VHF, UHF transceiver, and then we'll have an antenna, maybe on the top of the hood or the back or some other optimal location. And of course, this radio will be powered via the internal battery to the car, perhaps. Yeah, so it's mobile operation. Then we may have a handheld device, so a walkie-talkie, an HT, handy talkie. Of course, that needs to be charged, so we have a drop-in charger as well. So this may be some equipment that we'll own. So those are some of the things that we may be aiming for as we become licensed to acquire equipment so that we can now get on the air and operate, receive and transmit, and have those discussions with other fellow amateur radio operators. So, right, so that's just to give an idea of what we're aiming towards, what our license allows us to be able to do. Okay, so some of the technical topics for this evening, we start off with repeater station. So we have discussed repeaters before. This is extra information in terms of a slide for you. For sometimes a block diagram is useful for us to have available. So we will not get into too much of this optional information other than it will be available to you in your slide deck. However, it does define what a repeater station is, and we encourage you to take a look at it. Right, so we'll talk about this slide a little more. Again, we are on the topic of repeater stations, and we talked about what a repeater is. We have dealt with repeater operations before. But let's show what a repeater actually looks like. So on your screen, on the right-hand side, you will see this is a rack that is inside of a repeater station. And shortly, we'll show a slide as to what the outside of a repeater station might look like. So this is usually in a hut, preferably an air-conditioned or temperature-controlled room. And this is what a repeater station might look like. You have the actual transmitters here, receivers, and you may have some controllers. You may have other equipment such as duplexers, which allows one antenna to be used to simultaneously receive and transmit. Remember, we said a repeater is simultaneously receiving a signal and rebroadcasting it on another frequency. So this duplexer or canister or cavities are what are utilized. So this is just to give an idea as to what the inside of a repeater station might look like for us. Yeah. Right. So optional information, not on the exam, but just to give you an idea, some extra information as to the context of what all this looks like. All right. So we did say we will show what the outside of a repeater station looks like. So on the right-hand side here, this is a mountaintop repeater, and you have a tower and you have antennas and you have the hut. So that rack that we showed a little earlier will be housed inside of this hut, and hopefully again it's temperature controlled, environmental control, to keep it nice and cool, keep the dust out. And we have our antennas here that will receive the transmissions from our handheld or base or mobile devices, and it will then repeat or rebroadcast to a wide area. That's why repeaters tend to be in these high mountainous locations or on a tall building, because it will be able to receive and transmit wide area, extend our coverage or range, as sometimes we may call it. So this is what the outside of a repeater station might look like. All right, so let's get to the meat of the matter as far as the exams are concerned. Now this slide, this picture here should be quite familiar to most of us already. We have shown a repeater station diagrammatically on top of a hill. We have a repeater, and then we'll have our operators with a handheld radio transmitting to the repeater, and the repeater will be retransmitting wide area. And we have other amateur radio operators that will be listening. And of course, when we are finished transmitting, they will transmit to the repeater. The repeater will again rebroadcast that transmission, and we will now listen. So again, a little diagram to show how a repeater operates. And we of course note that the repeater will receive a signal on one frequency and retransmits it on another frequency. So on your slide is the exam question that you will get. So the type of amateur station that simultaneously retransmits the signal of another amateur station on a different channel or channels is called a repeater station. And this definition we need to learn for the exam. This should not be strange to us. We've been talking about this quite a bit throughout the course. And again, here is your diagram to remind you of what a repeater station is. It takes the signal from one frequency and simultaneously retransmits it on another frequency. Okay, let's continue. So that's repeater station. So we now come to the concept of an auxiliary station. So we will have an exam question shortly, but let's get a little bit into what an auxiliary station is. So we have extra information on your slide here, but there is the concept of where we talk about a repeater in use taking our transmission on one frequency and retransmitting it simultaneously. That's a repeater station. But we can have a station at our location that does something very similar. It takes the transmission from our radio on one frequency and retransmits it on another frequency. And sometimes those frequencies are in different bands. So we may transmit from our radio to the other radio on the VHF band, and it may retransmit it on the UHF band, probably going to a repeater itself or another station. So this functionality where we will use our own radio, maybe at our home location, or it could be mobile, and it receives a transmission on the VHF band and retransmits it on the UHF band, and vice versa. When there's a transmission on the UHF band that's coming into the radio, it will retransmit it on the VHF band. That is called crossband repeat. So crossband repeat or crossband repeating is an example of auxiliary station operation. So we don't need to know a whole lot about auxiliary station really for the exam. It comes in the exam, but we have just given a definition as to what it is and an example of auxiliary station. So crossband repeat is an example of auxiliary station operation. So you can read up this slide on your own time. Let's go now to discuss space stations, right? So a space station, again, is a station in space, right? So the repeater or the transceiver, instead of it being on land, it is in the sky, and in the sky out in outer space, right? It's orbiting the Earth. So an example of such a space station that we use in amateur radio is the International Space Station, also known as the ISS. There's a picture at the top of your screen here. That's what it looks like. We have the call signs, depending on where the space station is at any given time. These are the call signs that the space station will go by. Here's another diagram showing that we have the Earth, and then we have a couple of ground stations, and then we have this space station. This could be the ISS, or it could be one of many other satellites that amateur radio operators use. So that is what a space station is. Okay, so for the exam, they will ask this question, right? But we have just repeated a couple of the last slides, the pictures from them. We have the repeater station, we have the auxiliary station, and we have the space station, right? So this is the exam question. The type of amateur stations which can automatically retransmit the signals of other amateur stations are repeater, auxiliary, or space stations. Let's break that down a little bit. We're saying that it automatically retransmits the signals. That's why it's called an automatic station. So we don't need someone to be operating the station manually or an operator to be here. Neither this station, neither the space station, right? It automatically operates. Once it gets a signal, this repeater will receive the signal and automatically rebroadcast or retransmit. This crossband repeat station will also, which is the auxiliary station, will also receive the signal and automatically repeat it in both directions, of course. And the space station will do the same. Once there's a signal going to the satellite, it will retransmit. And that's why these are automatic stations. They will automatically retransmit the signals. And that's the exam question. And these three types of stations, repeater, auxiliary, and space stations, are examples of automatic stations. So this is what you need to learn for the exam. Again, just a tip. Remember, once we have a bullet point and you see some yellow writing, this is verbatim from the exam and the exam question, the question pool. All right. So we come now to the concept of linked repeaters or linked repeater networks. So on your right-hand side here, we have some extra information, again, just to give you an idea of what it might look like. So you have on the top here, you have multiple repeaters. This repeater has coverage for this area. This repeater can cover another geographical area. And a third repeater covers even another area. For persons in Trinidad and Tobago, maybe this repeater covers Trinidad, and maybe this other repeater covers Tobago, and so on, right? So whatever jurisdiction you are in, you may have multiple repeaters. And there's a way to link the repeaters. So sometimes these repeaters can be linked via what you call the Internet Protocol, or IP linking. You can also have links via RF or radio frequency, what we call backhaul links, right? So these links sorry about that, folks. So these links can be via RF. They can also be via IP or via the internet. So these repeaters can be linked to create one system by linking them. And that's what we mean by linked repeater networks. And here's a diagram, a network diagram that shows this, where we will have a repeater at one location, another repeater at another location, and we are linking them via the internet. So when we do that, we expand the coverage of our repeater system to a wide area coverage, and that's linked repeater networks. Give me 1 second, please. Right, my apologies for the pause, folks. Right, so to continue, this is linked repeater networks that we are discussing. So let's get to the exam question. All right, so again, we have another diagram here that shows that repeaters can be linked. We showed a diagram, network diagram, where it's linked via the internet or IP. In this instance here, we have another network diagram that shows that the repeaters can be also linked via RF or radio frequency backhaul links, right? So this is what we need to know for the exam. The following describes a linked repeater network, a network of repeaters in which signals received by one repeater are transmitted by all the repeaters in the network, right? So if we have one site here, and there's a radio operator that transmits to this repeater will of course retransmit it to wide area for all operators to hear. But this repeater will connect to this other repeater and send the signal, usually some backhaul link such as RF or internet. And this repeater will also transmit the same signal, and so on for all of the repeaters in this network. So that's what we mean that the signals that's received by one repeater will be transmitted by all of the repeaters because they are linked. And this is the exam question. Let's continue. So we now come to the concept of repeater offsets. So again, this should not be strange to us. We did say that a repeater will receive a transmission on one frequency and retransmit it on another frequency. So there is a rule of thumb in amateur radio that the difference between the input frequency and the output frequency, or the receive frequency and the transmit frequency, is usually a fixed value, and by convention for amateur radio. So we refer to the difference between those two frequencies as the repeater offset. Right. So we need to know the offset to be able to program our radio for the appropriate frequencies. If we don't know the frequency, imagine your broadcast radio, you're trying to tune to a radio station and you don't know the frequency. I mean, you could tune around and hope you'll get it. But in amateur radio, when we are transmitting, we need to know what frequency that repeater is listening on, and of course, what frequency it's broadcasting on. And we have that standard, what we call repeater offset or shift on the frequency between the receive and the transmit. So what we need to know for the exam is that there's a common repeater offset in the 2 meter band that is either plus or minus 600 kilohertz. So whatever the frequency of the repeater is, the other frequency will be offset by 600 kilohertz. So this is an exam question. And similarly, again, this is where notice that, you know, the 2 meter band and the 70 centimeter band and knowing what is VHF and UHF comes in, right? So that trusty table. So you can always compare and contrast using that table when we see 2 meter band, and we need to know what frequency are we talking about, right? So it's in the 140 something megahertz band, right? So that's a 2 meter band. So the offset or the shift is plus or minus 600 kilohertz. It can be either or, depending on the frequency and the configuration of the repeater. It's usually 600 kilohertz separation. Right, for the UHF band or the 70 centimeter band, a common repeater frequency offset is plus or minus 5 megahertz. So we need to learn these 2 bullet points for the exam. For the 2 meter band or the 140 something megahertz band, it's plus or minus 600 kilohertz. For the 70 centimeter band or the 400 megahertz band, it's plus or minus 5 megahertz. And this is pretty standard. Right. So another concept that we need to learn when we are talking about our radio system. So not only do we need to know the frequency that we're operating on, that we are transmitting on or receiving. If we're using a repeater, we need to know that repeater transmit frequency. We need to know the repeater receive frequency. So let's say we know all of that. But is there anything else that we do need to know in programming our radio to be able to access the repeater successfully? And the answer is yes. So there's something called CTCSS, which stands for Continuous Tone Coded Squelch System. It is sometimes known as PL, and PL is actually a trademark name of Motorola called Private Line, and sometimes people call it the tone. But CTCSS, which is the term you need to know for the exam, it's actually a subaudible tone. You can't hear it. It is transmitted once you program your radio with that tone or that CTCSS value. It is transmitted along with your signal. Remember, we said that when you're transmitting, you press the push to talk button on your radio, whether it's the handheld, base, or mobile. You press that PTT, you press that push to talk, and you speak into it. And you modulate the radio frequency carrier, that radio signal that is generated by your radio and amplifier that goes to your antenna. Your voice is superimposed on it. But when you have CTCSS also, that is superimposed on the carrier as well, except that it's subaudible, meaning that someone cannot hear it. It's a very low frequency. And on your screen, we actually have what those frequencies are. So you see CTCSS tone frequencies in hertz, 67 hertz, 82 hertz, 250 hertz, very low frequencies that we will not be able to hear as human beings, but it goes along with our carrier, it goes along with our voice. As we transmit, it goes out of the antenna, that signal that is sent out via radio. It is received by the repeater because the repeater is expecting that CTCSS. Matter of fact, you will see an exam question a little bit later on that unless you have that correct tone or CTCSS programmed, your radio will not be able to access the repeater to transmit. So these are some of the settings that we need to program into our radio when we are programming it to access repeaters. So it's not only the transmit frequency and the receive frequency that we need to punch into our radio, we also need to know if there is a CTCSS or a tone for that repeater, and we need to program it as well. So for the exam, what you need to know is that CTCSS is a term that describes the use of a subaudible tone transmitted along with normal voice audio to open the squelch of a receiver. So let's break that down a little bit. We talked about what the squelch is prior. So a repeater also has a squelch. Remember we said when we turn that squelch up just so that it just clips the noise, the background noise that is inherent in especially FM receivers, right? So the CTCSS will allow the repeater to listen to the rest of the signal, but it's required to open the repeater squelch. So that's what they mean by open the squelch of a receiver. And that's subaudible tone. Those are the frequencies we have on your chart here. It's subaudible. Subaudible means you cannot hear it. All right. The radio, of course, will know it's there. The repeater will know it's there, but you will not hear it. So again, it's a subaudible tone. And this is what you need to know for the exam, what CTCSS is. All right, let's do a couple more slides before we take our break. So another function that we will find on our radio is called the reverse function feature. So what is the reverse function feature? So it's sometimes a button that we press, sometimes it's something we go into the menu and select, sometimes we program it to a soft key on our radio. But the feature called reverse function, what that does, normally when we are listening on our radio, we are listening to the receive frequency or rather the transmit of the repeater. But sometimes we want to monitor the other frequency, the go frequency or the transmit frequency that we are transmitting, or the frequency that the repeater is receiving on. So remember, for repeater operation, you have two frequencies, the go or the transmit and the receive frequency. So if you want to monitor that other frequency, your transmit frequency, you can press that receive function button, or turn on the reverse, I should say the reverse function button, or turn on the reverse function feature, and it will allow you temporarily to listen to the transmit frequency. Now, ordinarily, you will not want to listen to that transmit frequency. What you want to listen to is the repeater transmit frequency, not your transmit frequency, right? But sometimes for diagnostics and some other reasons, maybe if you have a fox hunt where you need to find a transmitter or something like that, or you have interference that's being caused, you sometimes want to listen to the input to the repeater, so you will press that button. And what it does, it switches between the two frequencies. So this is a repeater pair that we have here on the screen, 147.330 megahertz. That frequency is what your radio will transmit out to the repeater. It's what the repeater will listen in. And then it's 147.930 is what your radio will be listening on when you're in receive mode. It's also the frequency that the repeater will be transmitting. That's how it works. But if you want to listen to the transmit of your radio, let's say to listen to the transmit of another person who might be transmitting, you want their output frequency or the repeater input, you press that reverse function feature, and all of a sudden, instead of listening to 147.930, your radio will be listening now to 147.330 temporarily, until you press it again and you go back to normal operation. So for the exam, you need to know that a VHF, UHF transceiver's reverse function is used to listen on a repeater's input frequency. That's the exam question. All right, so we did touch a bit on deviation previously, but there's another exam question in relation to over deviation, right? So again, over deviation is when we over-modulate our, so again, this diagram should be familiar to us. So in FM, when we modulate, we shift our frequency to the left or to the right of the center frequency, and there is a specification for the maximum or peak deviation that we should have, right? But sometimes if we drive our audio too hard, we put too much modulation, our voice is too loud, or microphone gain is too high, we can over deviate. And we had discussed previously that could cause distortion, right? So that's again the exam question here, that a cause of your FM transmission audio to be distorted on voice peaks is that you are talking too loudly. So you can just step away from the microphone a little bit so that you will not overdrive and over deviate. So that's the exam question. All right, let's do a couple more slides. All right, so we're now coming into some practical tips or practical information, right? And this is when we are actually operating as amateur radio operators. You have your license, you have your equipment, and you're authorized to make contacts now. You can transmit, you can receive legally because you have an amateur radio license. So how do you call another amateur radio station? So you have your radio, we showed where it's your mobile, your handheld, or your base station. You're turning that dial, you're punching in the frequency, and you want to call another amateur radio operator. Well, how do you do that? Well, it's an exam question, and it goes as follows. An appropriate way to call another station on a repeater, if you know the other station's call sign, is you say the station's call sign, then identify with your call sign. So let's break that down a little bit. So we have our repeater here, we have our radio, and there are other amateur radio operators that are listening on that frequency, and we want to call one of them. So that's what our objective is. But how do we do that? Well, we have a protocol, we have a formality, and we are trained radio operators, so we must follow that amateur radio protocol. Identification. And when you get your amateur radio license, you get a call sign. So my call sign is 9Y4R, or 9 Yankee 4 Romeo. My good friend Franz in St. Lucia is Juliet 69 Delta Sierra, J69DS. That's his call sign. So if I'm going to call Franz on the air, I will press my push to talk, make sure it's pressed properly, I don't speak too quickly, and then I will say Juliet 69 Delta Sierra, 9 Yankee 4 Romeo. That's how I'll make the call. So that's what this bullet point here means. If I'm going to call another station on a repeater, I will use their call sign followed by my call sign. Now, just a little bit of a tip. Sometimes people get that mixed up. Quite often you'll see people doing the reverse, but this is the proper way. You state the other station's call sign first, followed by your call sign when you're calling them. So sometimes to get it right, what you can do is use the word from. So you could either say it, verbalize it, or you could think it in your mind. Another way is Juliet 69 Delta Sierra from 9 Yankee 4 Romeo. So you don't have to say the from, but you can think it and you'll get the order right. If you're saying to, that order is not quite correct. It doesn't sound very professional also. So you state the station's call sign, who you're calling their call sign first, and then you state your call sign, right? So that's why the word from can be helpful in this context as an aide de memoire. So what about if we don't know who is on the air and we want to call someone? So we don't know the call sign of the other operators that are listening. Maybe we are a new amateur radio operator and we don't know. So one way is to listen, and hopefully you'll hear other stations talking and you'll get their call signs. But maybe you have waited 5 minutes, you haven't heard anything, and you're excited to, speak to someone. Or it could be very early in the morning and you don't know who is on the air. Maybe people are having breakfast, or maybe they're not at home, or they're busy or at work, and you don't know who is on the air, and you want to call someone, you want to talk with someone, or maybe you want to find out, how your signal is into the repeater, for instance, right? Do you have good access? Are you loud and clear? So you are looking for contact. How do you do that? You do not know the call sign of any other station that's listening. You do not know their call signs. So the way you do that is the following indicates that a station is listening on a repeater and looking for contact. What you do, you state the station's call sign, that is your call sign, followed by the word monitoring. So you can say 9 Yankee 4 Romeo monitoring. And oftentimes if someone is free, they may say, hey, okay, I've just heard that call sign. Let me get back to them, or let me just let them know I'm also monitoring, or just have a quick conversation, or what we call a QSO. So that's how we do it. And that's an exam question. So again, the example is I will come up on the air, press my push to talk, make sure that I'm not truncating my voice, make sure it's properly depressed, the repeater has been accessed, and I say 9 Yankee 4 Romeo. I'm using phonetics. We'll come to phonetics in a while. 9 Yankee 4 Romeo monitoring. And then I will release my push to talk, not too soon. Make sure that I haven't truncated my last syllable. After I've said the last syllable in my word, I give it a half a second or so, then I release my push to talk. That's a practical operation. So this is how we make contact in amateur radio. Let's do one more slide before we take our break. So we have talked about repeater operation. We need to know now about simplex operations. So repeater operation is also called duplex. So at the bottom of your screen here, this is repeater operation. It's also called a duplex operation. We have our radio, we transmit to the repeater, and the repeater will repeat on another frequency for other amateur radio operators to hear. But what is simplex transmission or simplex operation? Doesn't use a repeater. Simplex is really radio to radio transmission. So notice in this case at the top here, there's this amateur radio operator. He's transmitting on one frequency, and the other amateur radio operator is transmitting on the same frequency. And the signal, the RF, the radio frequency, is going from radio to radio directly, antenna to antenna. It's going off into the air and going straight to the other operator. That's direct or simplex operation. So for the exam, we need to know that simplex is a term that describes an amateur station that is transmitting and receiving on the same frequency. Notice and compare and contrast with duplex or repeater operation. You actually transmit on one frequency and you receive on another frequency. So that's one major difference between repeater operation or duplex mode and simplex operation. Exam question. We also need to know that simplex channels are designated in the VHF, UHF band plans, and we'll come to what a band plan is very shortly. So stations within range of each other can communicate without tying up a repeater. So imagine you're just a couple of houses away, or maybe you're just a town away, or maybe a couple of miles away, and you want to have a long conversation with another amateur radio operator. If you can talk simplex, why tie up a repeater? Leave the repeater for other operators to use who may not be able to talk direct to each other. So if you're going to have a long, what we call a rag chew in amateur radio, you're going to have a long conversation, a 1 hour discussion on a technical topic, maybe how to configure a hotspot for amateur radio use. and that's going to take you half an hour, and you're going to react to, or you're going to have a technical discussion, maybe you should take it on a simplex frequency. And they're just simply saying that there are simplex frequencies that are designated in the band plan. So instead of you tying up a repeater, you can select those frequencies and communicate with another amateur radio operator. It's an exam question. So we need to know for the exam also that this frequency that we have published on the top of your slide, 146.520 megahertz, that simplex frequency is what is called the national calling frequency. And it's an exam question. It's in the 2-meter band, and you need to learn it. The national calling frequency for FM simplex operations in the 2-meter band is 146.520 megahertz. So with that, folks, let us take a 2-minute break. Get up, take a little stretch, maybe a bathroom break, have some water, and we'll be right back in 2 minutes time. All right. Okay, Vishon is asking, in terms of ham radio, is there a difference in a space telescope and a space station? If so, what is it? Yes, I would say definitely a difference. So you have space telescopes such as the Hubble. You also have the many other telescopes that are in space, right? Some are optical telescopes and some other types of telescopes. You have telescopes on the ground as well. But the space station, in our case, the International Space Station, will accommodate persons to stay on board. Space stations generally are not telescopes. Generally, space telescope is a very specific thing. So Not that you cannot have a telescope on a space station, but generally you don't find that. The space telescopes tend to be fit for purpose and specialized, whereas space stations such as the International Space Station, and you also have other satellites, tend to have other purposes, and they tend to also have repeaters. Just like you'll have repeaters on land, you put the repeater in space with the appropriate antenna, and you have very good coverage for amateur radio operators to talk around the world. So generally, yes, they are different things. Excellent question indeed. So Craig, that's a good question. The hardware cost could be easily around $20,000-$25,000 or more. And of course, you also have to have a host or a tower. That will be additional cost, and then recurring costs as well for electricity, air conditioning, and maybe rental of the facility, right? But the equipment itself, you could think about $25,000 TT dollars, right? As a start, in terms of the equipment for proper, it could get a little bit less, especially if you operate used equipment or repurposed equipment. And you can also go more than that based on higher power transmitters, as well as better filters. Sometimes you have to deal with interference and you may need additional equipment as well. Sometimes you may want to put additional equipment on the repeater side, things such as a circulator and other filters, which adds to the cost. So not easy to answer, but I'll just say 20 to 25K for the equipment to start with, right? But take that with a grain of salt. It really depends on many other things as well. Yeah. Matter of fact, that figure I give you could be a little bit on the low ball side. Yeah. Hope that helps. All right, great. So let's restart where we left off. Right. So I think we stopped at simplex operations, right? All right. Let's continue. All right. So we have been talking a bit about how do we operate in a practical way. So we're doing a lot of theoretical constructs. We have gotten into a little bit on actual operating procedures. How do we actually operate our radio equipment? So we also need to be aware of the term CQ in amateur radio. It's a pro word or a procedural signal. And what it means is that you're calling any station. So you may not know the call sign of a station. So let's say I go up on HF and I tune to 7.159 megahertz. And I don't know who is out there, but I know there are people who may stand by. I may choose to call CQ, meaning calling any station. So I may say CQ, CQ, CQ. This is 9 Yankee 4 Romeo, for example. That's one way to make that call. And the CQ simply means calling any station, right? So it's an abbreviation if you want to call it that, right? So a procedural signal. So that's an exam question. The meaning of the procedural signal CQ is calling any station. And we gave the example as to what it might sound like if you're making that call. However, before you make that call, protocol and etiquette and proper amateur radio practice requires you to do a couple of things before you make that call on a frequency. And that's why we're all being trained. We need to know this. Firstly, we need to listen that no one else is using the frequency before we transmit. At best, that's a bit obnoxious, right? Someone is using the frequency and you just go and transmit all over them. So what we want to do is be very courteous and listen first for a couple of minutes. Make sure there's no transmission in progress. Of course, if we have an emergency, that's different, right? While we listen for a little while, make sure no one else is using it before we call CQ. And even if we have not heard anything, the polite and proper operation is to ask if the frequency is in use. So we can say something like, this is 9 Yankee for Romeo. Is this frequency in use? Right, so notice that we're identifying our station, we're identifying our call sign. And also, very importantly, make sure that the frequency that you have tuned into, that you have a license or your license specifies that you can use that frequency, that you are authorized to use that frequency. The reason is different classes of licenses will carry different permissions or privileges. So the system that we're doing, the technician, general, and extra classes on the American system carries different frequency that we can use legitimately for the various classes of licenses. So make sure that the frequency that you punch in on your radio, you can use it based on your license. So that's an exam question. Before calling CQ, listen first to be sure that no one else is using the frequency. Ask if the frequency is in use and make sure you are authorized to use that frequency. Exam question. So when someone calls CQ and we have heard that call and we would like to respond, there's a way that we respond. So let's say my good friend Franz in St. Lucia has come up on 7.159 megahertz lower sideband, and he is making a call CQ. He says something like CQ, CQ, CQ. This is Juliet 69 Delta Sierra. So should I choose to respond to him? Let's say I want to speak to Franz. I will say Juliet 69 Delta Sierra. This is 9 Yankee for Romeo. Over, for example. So for the exam, we need to know you should respond to a station calling CQ by transmitting the other station's call sign followed by your call sign. So notice the order always is the other station call sign, then yours, right? So always think from. Right, exam question. Let's continue. So sometimes we need to test our radio. We want to make sure our radio is transmitting and we go on a frequency. So sometimes we talked about a dummy load, you may want to transmit into a dummy load to test your radio, but sometimes you want to do an on-air transmission, an on-air test. And if you're doing that, you don't just key the microphone and say testing 1, 2, 3, testing 1, 2, 3. Neither do you whistle into the microphone and that sort of thing like that. What you need to ensure is whatever test you're performing, that you identify your call sign. So that's an exam question. The following is required when making on-the-air test transmissions. Identify the transmitting station. What that means is that you state your call sign. So for example, I'll say, this is 9 Yankee for Romeo testing, for example. So we also need to know about the Q code, or what's referred to as Q signals. So on your right-hand side here, we have some Q codes, QRM, QRN, QRP, and the meaning. But for the exam, we have a couple of Q codes that we need to learn. So again, these are like abbreviations. So the Q signal, which indicates that you're receiving interference from other stations, is QRM. Right? You're telling that person that you are getting or receiving interference. QRM. Exam question. Need to learn this. There's another Q code that we need to learn for the exam. The Q signal, which indicates that you are changing frequency, is QSY. So you want to indicate that you're going to change the frequency from one to the other, you say that you're going to QSY, right? So you verbalize it in audio. Of course, if you're doing CW or Morse code, you give those letters. Again, nice shorthand, and you have a little table with some of the more popular Q codes, extra information for you. What you need to learn is QRM, which is interference, and QSY, which is changing frequency for the exam. So we did mention the concept of band plans. What is a band plan? So apart from when you get your license, you are authorized to use certain frequencies. If you're a technician class operator, you can use certain frequencies. If you're a general class, you can have access to more frequencies. And if you're an extra class, well, you have the whole hog, the entire range of frequencies as a fully licensed extra class operator. But even though you have those arrangements per your license, even within the band that you are authorized to use, there's something called a band plan that segments those frequency segments that you are authorized to use and some parts of that band will be used for one thing and not another. So for example, we have two examples of band plans here, right? We will get a little more into band plan when we go into the general class level, which we intend to run right after the technician class. You'll see a lot more information on band planning inside of there. But this is an example of the band plan, shows the different bands and the start frequency, the end frequency, or the edge frequencies. And inside of there, we've just blown up one of them. So on the 80 meter band, and the 80 meter band is 3.5 megahertz, that area there. Notice that the various classes of licenses, E is extra class, A is what we call the advanced class, what we call a grandfathered class, T is technician, N is novice, it's another class that is grandfathered, and G, general. So these are the various classes. Notice they all have a different what that you can use on the frequency, but even within the frequency that you can use, notice it's further divided. It says, this red here says it's data or RTTY mode, and green here shows that it's phone and image. Remember what we said phone was? Anytime you hear phone in amateur radio, that is voice. So phone means that you can do voice here, but in this section here, you're permitted only RTTY and data, that sort of thing, right? You should not do voice here. So that's what the concept of a band plan is. Even though you're authorized as an extra class operator to operate between 3.5 megahertz and 4 megahertz on the 80 meter band, that's legitimate. You can use all of it. But the band plan says that from 3.5 megahertz to 3.6 megahertz, it should be RTTY or some other data mode. And from 3.6 megahertz to 4 megahertz as an extra class operator, you can do phone and image and so on, right? But you should not do voice in this segment of the band. And that structuring that says that is called the band plan. So for the exam, a band plan beyond privileges established by the FCC, meaning your license, is a voluntary guideline for using different frequency or different modes or activities within an amateur band. So notice that it's voluntary. It's not specified by the authority. It is something as a community. So quite often the IARU, the International Amateur Radio Union, gets together and works out band plans for the various regions, regions 1, 2, and 3. And we try as best as possible to stick with the band plan because it helps us avoid interference. So this is the exam question. What is a band plan? All right, so let's move right along. So sometimes when we are operating on amateur radio, we may find that two operators end up on the same frequency and trying to use it simultaneously. I'm trying to make a call and my good friend Franz, he's also on the same frequency and he's trying to make a call as well. So both of us try to use the same frequency. What should we do? Should we, argue with each other, sort of fight and get into a sort of tussle and say, no, I was here first? No, that's not what we do. That's not in the spirit of amateur radio. As amateur radio operators, we are courteous. So we need to work it out, as they say, right? We should negotiate with each other and say, hey, Franz, you know what? You go ahead and use this. I will shift, 10 kilohertz down or up or something like that. Or maybe, I will move to the other band and maybe when you're finished, I'll come up here. Or Franz will say, just 15 minutes I need and, afterwards you can use it. We work it out as good, friendly amateur radio operator colleagues. We don't try to get into an argument about it. We try to be very nice about it, very cordial. So we need to know for the exam that the following applies when two stations transmitting on the same frequency interfere with each other. The stations should negotiate continued use of the frequency. So that's what we say. Let's work it out. So we now come to a very important part of amateur radio operations. Emergency communications, or what we abbreviate as MCOMs. Important. That's where amateur radio really shines. When there are disasters, amateur radio operators come in. So you can read this slide if you wish and get a little more into what MCOMs or emergency communications is. But we will go straight to what the exam requires us to know. And by the way, on the right-hand side, there's this little go kit here for amateur radio emergency communications. There's a disaster. We can pick up this Pelican case and deploy it somewhere with our radio. We have a battery, equipment, and all we need to do is connect an antenna to this. So you have a power supply and all of that in cased into a nice Pelican case here, right? Allows us to deploy. So one of the things you can call this is a Go kit. All right, so we need to know a couple of things for the exam in relation to emergency communications. We need to know about two emergency communications organizations. One is called ARES and the other one is called RACES. So the first one, ARES, Amateur Radio Emergency Service, is a group of licensed amateurs who have voluntarily registered their qualifications and equipment for communications duty in the public service. So you need to learn this definition. What is ARES? Another definition you need to learn is RACES. Again, both are communications organizations geared especially towards emergency communications. Radio Amateur Civil Emergency Service. That's what RACES stand for. You need to learn these couple of bullet points. Come in your exam. What is RACES? It's a radio service using amateur frequencies for emergency management or civil defense communications. It is also a radio service using amateur stations for emergency management or civil defense communications. It's also an emergency service using amateur operators certified by a civil defense organization as being enrolled in that organization. So you need to learn these 3 bullet points. It will come in a question in your exam. Also, another question in the exam is this 4th bullet point, in that RACES is an FCC Part 97. Remember, we would have circulated with the question pool and all of the other documents. We would have given each participant a copy of FCC Part 97. That's our regulations. That's what we are using to govern amateur radio, at least in the United States. So an FCC Part 97 amateur radio service for civil defense communications during national emergencies. So that is also what RACES, RACES, RACES is also an FCC Part 97 amateur radio service for civil defense communications during national emergencies. So that's another exam question. So these 3 bullet points at the top here, one exam question, and this one is another one in relation to RACES. To learn this for the exam. So we need to discuss what nets or networks are, right? So on the top right-hand corner of your screen here, you will see multiple radio operators here. Each of them have a station and they may be using a repeater, and at an appointed time of the day, you may have a net control operator that comes up and announces that a net is in progress, and all of the other operators, amateur radio operators, will now try to check in on that frequency and say, give their call sign, their name, their call sign will be logged, and any information that they are sharing also, maybe they're giving weather information, maybe it's a different type of net, maybe it's a net to indicate probably activities, or maybe it's a hot swap net, or whatever the net is, they provide the relevant information to the net control operator, who acts like a chairperson. So you have the net, you have a net control station, and quite often that will be manned by a net control operator. So that is going on a particular frequency. At the same time, multiple amateur radio operators, the net control station will call the net, will usually say that this net is in progress. Sometimes it's a directed net where all stations must speak to the net control operator, sort of like the chairperson of a meeting, and they will sort of conduct the smooth flow. So they go onto a particular frequency. Oftentimes it can be a repeater. If it's an HF, it can also be a simplex HF frequency. The net control operator will take check-ins. They will log the call signs of all the operators who have checked into the network, and sometimes you have a quick exchange with each person. So there are different types of nets that exist, but we need to know that there is something called nets or networks that are set up on a particular frequency where several amateur radio operators participate in like a little conference. For the exam, we need to know what a net control station duty is, right? What that net control operator, so this guy on the right hand side here, he may be the net control operator that is conducting a net, and he's talking to several other operators who's calling him to check in, and he's logging. If you notice here, he has a piece of paper, a log sheet there, so he's writing down the call signs. So for example, the date will be on the sheet, the time, the call sign, as well as other information such as the signal of the person and any message that they pass. He will log that information. He may log their first name as well, and that's a log sheet. So a typical duty of a net control station is to call the net to order and direct communications between stations, checking in. Again, sort of like a chairperson in a meeting. And also, we should be aware that in a net, once you have that net control operator in effect, you shouldn't just transmit on the frequency. You should go through that net control if you need to transmit, or when that net control operator asks you to or tells you you can go ahead. So a standard practice when you participate in a net is that unless you are reporting an emergency, transmit only when directed by the net control station. So you need to observe and respect the net control station. We also need to know the definition of the term traffic. What is traffic? No, it's not related to vehicular traffic on the roadways. Traffic is really messages that are exchanged. So you have the network that's in operation. You have all of these operators talking to the net control station, and there are messages that are going back and forth. So that is considered traffic. So the term traffic in net operations refers to messages exchanged by net stations. So we also need to be aware that in terms of traffic handling, there's a characteristic that is considered good traffic handling, and that is when you pass messages exactly as received. So you want to have good integrity in that messaging. So when you pass that message, it's accurate, it is timely, it is pristine. That is a good characteristic of message handling or traffic handling. And that's an exam question. A characteristic of good traffic handling is passing messages exactly as received. Maybe this net is an emergency net. Maybe a tropical system has affected an island, and maybe we're doing health and welfare traffic. Maybe people are injured and we need to get assistance to that person, or maybe some resources required, medical attention, or maybe something like food or water supplies or something like that. And we need to make sure that that message is accurate, and that's where amateur radio shines. Getting that message there, getting it there accurately, and that is considered good traffic handling. So sometimes, to ensure that the message is accurately represented, how do we ensure? Sometimes, on the air, you can have challenging band conditions. It might be a little bit noisy. How can we ensure that when we are passing those messages, that the messages are correctly received? Well, one technique that we can use is to spell some of the key words in a message using the phonetic alphabet. And of course, the phonetic alphabet is on your screen. Each one should actually sound different to each other. So when you hear it, you know what letter it is. So Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Echo, Foxtrot. For example, those are examples of the phonetic alphabet. It's on your screen. We highly recommend all radio operators learn the phonetic alphabet. It's very helpful. It's very useful. It comes in very handy during an emergency or any sort of conditions where communications might be a little bit difficult. You might want to spell words. And in an emergency, it's so important to get that message correctly. And when you spell those words out using the phonetics, it can improve the quality of the message and the accuracy of the message because you've spelled that word out. So a technique used, and this is an exam question, technique used to ensure that voice messages containing unusual words are received correctly is to spell the words using a standard phonetic alphabet, such as this one on your screen here, the NATO phonetic alphabet. And let's give an example, the word bag. If I'm spelling the word bag and the person is not understanding me, or they haven't heard me correctly, I will spell it for them. I'll say it's, this should be Bravo. Sorry for this, the typo. That's Bravo Alpha Golf. So that person, oh, you mean bag, right? Because I've spelled it phonetically. Very useful technique to use when we are passing messages and the conditions are difficult and we want to get that meaning pristine across to the other side. Use the phonetic alphabet. So we now come to a topic, message handling or formal traffic messages. So I will not go into the detail of this slide. You can read it on your own time. We will go straight to what we need to know for the exam. Right. So there's the concept of message handling, or what we are calling formal traffic messages. And on your right hand side here, there's a form, and this form is structured in a particular way, and we are also calling this the radiogram. And when we look at the form, we have highlighted some various sections of this form. It's a very structured way of passing messages. It helps. It's a standardized way. And amateur radio operators are encouraged to use this, especially in emergencies, when we are handling emergencies, to make sure that the messages are accurately passed and we have a good record of it. So at the top here, you'll notice we have a section called the header or the preamble. It has some information. There's another section called the address. There's a middle section that's called the text. And there's a section called the signature. So the prior slide will get into detail as to what each of these sections are about. So we encourage you to read the previous slide. We have a lot more details as to these sections, but just to show you, the formal traffic message, also sometimes called a radiogram, has its sections that contain specific pieces of information. And it does help to track the message with all of this information that we have here. It also helps us to ensure that the message is accurate and it is received by the intended recipient. So for the exam, we need to know that information contained in the preamble of a formal traffic message is the information needed to track the message. So the preamble is this top section of the formal traffic message. So if you look at it, you'll see a number, you'll see the precedence, you will see check number, where it's coming from, date, time, and so on. So this is called the preamble. Some people will call it the header information. Also for the exam, we need to know about the check field. So you'll notice here there's a field called check. So this is message number 15. So check in a radiogram header means the number of words or word equivalents in the text portion of the message. Let's see if that is true. So we see there's 15 here. So it says check. Let's count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. We could have easily multiplied 5 by 3, and we notice that there are 15 words in this message. So that's where this check comes in. So when we're passing a message, it's like a checksum, right? Where we know how many words in the message, and when you pass that check, you see if you actually got 15 words in that message. That helps with the accuracy. If you only got 14 or you got 16, you'll know something is wrong somewhere, right? So this is an exam question. You need to know what check is in the radiogram or for the formal traffic message. All right, a couple more slides to go. Right, so we need to have an idea about emergencies and what is permitted in emergency conditions and what's not permitted. So there's a trick question in your exam, and that trick question is, when do FCC rules not apply to the operation of an amateur radio station? When can you flout the FCC rules? Well, the answer is never. FCC rules always apply. So of course we'll come to a caveat in a little bit in terms of what you call true emergency situations, right? But we need to know for the exam that FCC rules always apply. At no point in time should an operator think that the rules do not apply. It always applies. And on your right-hand side here, we would have given a copy of the content of Part 97. So you might want to take a look at it to see what it says, but this is just to show you this is the FCC Part 97 rules. All right. Also, we need to know in an emergency situation that amateur station control operators are permitted to operate outside the frequency privileges of their license class only in situations involving the immediate safety of human life or protection of property. What this means is in an emergency, let's say you are a technician class operator and you need to save a life, then even though your technician class license specifies that you could only operate certain modes and on certain frequencies, if it is to save a life, well, under those conditions, you will be permitted to operate on a frequency that you would not normally be able to as a technician class operator. So there are these little exceptions or these little caveats. So even though we say here FCC rules always applies, there is provision in there for these types of situations, emergencies. Again, that's where amateur radio shines, an emergency situation. So note, always need to follow the rules, but there are some conditions under which you have a bit of flexibility. Not too much, just a little bit. Okay. So we now come to amateur satellite operation. So we had dealt with satellite operation before. We had talked about space stations. So we will see here that an amateur satellite really is putting a repeater on a spacecraft. That is what an amateur satellite is. Now that spacecraft can be the ISS or the International Space Station, or it can be a dedicated CubeSat or some other smaller satellite that has that repeater installed. So this is an example of a satellite, and you have two operators that are trying to communicate with each other on the surface of the Earth, and they're using the repeater on, in this case here, the International Space Station. They transmit it, and the space station as a repeater will dutifully repeat that on another frequency. What we need to be aware of is that there's the concept of the uplink frequency and the downlink frequency, or the transmit from our radio and the receive. And they're two different frequencies, and they also tend to be in two different bands, cross band, similar to cross band repeat, right? As we had discussed previously. So you have the uplink frequency and you have the downlink frequency. All right, so you may be wondering, with my technician class license, can I use a satellite? The answer is yes, of course you can. As a technician class licensee, you are permitted to utilize satellites, and that's actually quite fantastic, because sometimes you don't really need a lot of equipment to operate satellite. A handy talkie, believe it or not, you can operate a satellite. It's amazing what you can do as an amateur radio operator. So for the exam, you need to know that any amateur holding a technician class or higher license may contact the International Space Station, also called the ISS, on VHF bands. So you're a technician class operator or higher, general, extra, advanced, and so on. You can use the International Space Station's repeater and communicate. We also need to be aware, because we said that for amateur radio, you transmit on one frequency for a repeater and receive on another frequency. But for the space station or the amateur satellite operation, it's crossband, meaning that you're transmitting on one band. It can be VHF or it could be UHF, and you receive on the other band. So the mode that we refer to when we're doing that, if the uplink is UHF and the downlink is VHF, it's called the UV mode. If it's the reverse, where the uplink is VHF and the downlink is UHF, it will be called VU mode. However, for the exam, we need to know about UV mode. So we have a satellite here, AO91, also called Fox 1 Bravo. That's a satellite that is in orbit around the Earth, and that satellite uses UV mode. We actually put, these are real frequencies here, by the way. You can actually monitor the satellite if you have the ability to. So if you want to transmit and use a repeater on AO91, you will transmit on 435.250 megahertz. That's in the UHF band. So that's why it's U, and you will receive on 145.960 megahertz, which is in the VHF band, and that's V. So that's why it's called UV mode. Uplink is U, downlink is V. And that's an exam question. Let's get to it. The statement that a satellite is operating in UV mode means the satellite uplink is in the 70 centimeter band and the downlink is in the 2 meter band. And we put some stuff in white there for you, meaning it's crossband repeat, UHF, VHF. So you see again why it's important to know for the particular wavelength, whether it's UHF, VHF, right? So you need to have a little reference point. That trusty slide can be quite helpful. So this is the real information here, folks. If you have to use this satellite called AO91, this is the actual frequency and the downlink, right? So additional information such as the CTCSS is also required to access it, but it's not on this slide. Okay. Another slide on amateur satellite operation. We need to be aware that these satellites are multi-mode sometimes they have different modes that you can operate, things like APRS. You may be able to operate SSB, FM, and so on, right? So there are different modes of transmissions. And by the way, this is satellite AO92 Fox 1 Delta, And notice a different frequency to AO91, right? So we actually give you the frequencies here. We didn't put in the tones, but nonetheless, these are the actual frequencies if you had to listen to them. All right. So when you are transmitting, you need to know what mode that you're using, whether it's FM, whether it's SSB, and so on, right? D star. So different satellites utilize different modes. But for the exam, we need to know that the mode of transmission that is commonly used by amateur radio satellites are FM, which is frequency modulation, SSB, which is single sideband, CW, which is continuous wave or Morse code, or data. This is an exam question. The common modes that are used by amateur radio satellites. We also need to be aware, like everything else, interference is important. We need to avoid interference. We need to avoid causing other amateur radio operators stress. So we need to be aware that when we're transmitting, remember we said that as an amateur radio operator, we need to use the least amount of power that is necessary to make the contact. So we do not want to use more power than necessary. And if we use more power than necessary, in the case of a satellite operation, we might end up interfering or blocking other amateur radio operators. And that's an exam question. The impact of using excessive effective radiated power on a satellite uplink is blocking access by other users. So in other words, don't overpower, don't use more power than necessary, just use the amount of power to make that contact and no more. Not because you could run a lot of power, you need to just run. If 5 watts will work, use 5 watts. You don't need to go to 50 watts or 100 watts or so. Use the lowest amount of power that's necessary. All right, a couple more slides again to go. We're still on amateur satellite operation. So we need to be aware that one of the ways that we determine whether the power is just right is to listen to our transmission on the downlink and compare it to the beacon. And we'll come shortly to what the beacon is. So apart from the satellite having the repeater, there are also other transmissions such as telemetry or beacon information that it is sending out. And you can listen to that as well. So the exam question is a way to determine whether your satellite uplink power is neither too low nor too, that should be high, again typo there, is that your signal strength on the downlink should be about the same as the beacon. So that's a technique if you want to know if your transmit power to the satellite is too high or too low. What you do is you listen to the beacon and check that signal, and it should be about the same as your output from the repeater on the satellite. So that's an exam question. Also, we need to be aware of the different orbits of satellites. So you have orbits at one level, orbits at another level, and even larger orbits. But for the exam, we need to know what is LEO, low Earth orbit. So this is the low Earth orbit. And then we have a medium Earth orbit, and then we have what is called the geostationary orbit. Right? That's geostationary means when the satellite is in space, it appears to be at the same spot over the Earth at all times. That's what's geostationary. All of the other satellites in LEOs, they actually move. So the ISS is always constantly moving relative to the Earth. Right? So you will always see it coming overhead for a couple of minutes and then going past the horizon, and maybe several hours later it'll come overhead for about 3-4 minutes again, and that's how they go with those low Earth orbit satellites. And we have some information here as to the difference between LEO, MEO, and GEO, which is low Earth orbit, medium, and of course geostationary. Extra information for you. For the exam, we need to know simply that a LEO satellite is a satellite in low Earth orbit, and that's what LEO stands for. All right, so we did talk about satellites having multiple transmitters on board. So you have one that is going to be the repeater, you transmit it, it will repeat, but there's also a transmitter on board that is sending out information, telemetry information, what is sometimes known as a beacon, because it is just continuously broadcasting. So we have our satellite here in space. This may be a nice little CubeSat, and we have transmissions that are going out continuously, and that is the telemetry or beacon information, which we can also listen to on the frequency of that beacon. So what does it contain? It contains status information. So again, we have a little typo here. Sorry about that, folks. A satellite beacon is a transmission from a satellite that contains status information. This is an exam question. Beacon off of a satellite. What does it contain? Status information. And by the way, we just put up on your screen here, you don't need to learn this for the exam, but what do we mean by status or status information? This is an example of status information that you actually get from the telemetry or from the beacon from the satellite. It shows you the time, the date, latitude, longitude, frequency, the temperature, so many other parameters that you'll get. Again, telemetry information that's coming via the beacon. It's transmitting continuously. So that's the other part of the exam question. Telemetry information that is typically transmitted by satellite. Beacons are health and status of the satellite. So this is the health information and the status of the satellite. That's what's transmitted on or via the beacon frequency. So you may wonder, who can listen to that telemetry information? Do you have to be a licensed ham or amateur radio operator to do so? No, the answer is anyone may receive telemetry information from, again, a typo, from a space station. All right, so we'll correct these couple typos for when we circulate the slide deck. So these are the exam questions in relation to beacons and telemetry. All right, so we need to be familiar with a term called Doppler shift. So we wouldn't get too much into it. You can read this as you wish at your own time. But what we will say is that most of us would know what Doppler is. If you are standing in one spot and you have an ambulance or a siren from a police vehicle or some other vehicle, as it approaches us, you might find or you might hear that the pitch is increasing, and then as it goes away, you will find that the frequency becomes lower, the pitch goes a little lower. So that is Doppler shift. The actual frequency doesn't really change. It's just as it's moving closer to us, the wave is compressing, and as it moves away from us, the wave is stretching out. So that's what is called Doppler shift or Doppler effect. But we need to know for the exam that we can track the satellite. So this is a satellite tracking program, piece of software. You have software for Windows, software for Mac OS, software for Linux, and you can track all of these satellites. You can track many satellites, but you can also certainly track amateur radio satellites, real-time tracking. So you'll know where it is at any point. You'll also see the footprint of the satellite. In other words, where radio transmissions can be heard or received from. That's the footprint, and the satellite will be moving, especially those that are not geostationary. You'll see them tracking and moving all the time continuously. So for the exam, we need to know that the following are provided by satellite tracking programs. This is an example of satellite tracking program. There are several of them free. There are also some paid ones. It shows maps showing the real-time position of the satellite track over the Earth. So that's one of the things it shows. It also allows you to see the time, the azimuth and elevation of the start, maximum altitude, and end of a pass. So the satellite will be coming overhead. So this is Trinidad and Tobago, for example. The satellite is coming overhead. You have the acquisition of, and then it goes past the horizon and we can no longer see the satellite. So the time, which is important. What time is it going to come overhead that we can access it? What is called the azimuth and also the elevation. So the azimuth is the angle on the horizontal plane. You know, what direction is it? East, west, north, south. And the elevation is up, down. You know, how high up above the horizon do we need to look? So you have the azimuth and the elevation. It gives you that information in the tracking program. It also tells you the maximum altitude as well as when the pass is going to end. Also, it will tell us, because of the Doppler effect, it will tell us the apparent frequency of the satellite transmission. Because our radio will need to be adjusted, we need to punch the frequency in as the satellite comes towards us, and as it's overhead, and as it passes over and goes to the other side of the horizon, we need to adjust the frequency to take an account for the Doppler effect. And the tracking program will usually provide us with all of this information. Exam question. So continuing, I think this is our last slide, continuing on tracking satellites. We need to know that for this software to work, this tracking program, what are called the Keplerian elements are required to be input into the satellite tracking program. Now, almost all modern tracking programs, you simply go and say, click update, couplers or Keplerian elements, and it will pull it down from the internet. But you need to know for the exam that those are key inputs, because that is what tells you where the satellite is. That's the essential information for each, the configuration information, if you will, for the program to know where each satellite is. That's called the Keplerian elements, and those are inputs into the satellite tracking program. When you download it, it will have a set of it already, but for some of the newer satellites, it may not be. Also, that changes over time sometimes, so that you have to sometimes download updates from the internet. It's a key input to allow. If it's inaccurate, then the program, the software, the satellite tracking software will not properly show you where the satellite is. Okay, so another exam question. The Doppler shift in reference to satellite communication is an observed change in the signal frequency caused by relative motion between the satellite and the Earth station. So again, similar to an ambulance, when it's coming towards us and as it goes away from us, we'll notice an observed change in the frequency or the pitch. The same thing happens with the satellite as it goes overhead. It's coming towards us, and therefore the frequency is compressed, and as it goes away from us, it's elongated. So we need to know the Doppler shift for that satellite communication is that change in the observed change in the frequency that is caused by the relative motion between the satellite as it moves overhead and the Earth station. Exam question. So our satellite may look like this, and the satellite is not necessarily stationary, even geostationary satellites are not necessarily stationary, right? But especially those that are LEO satellites, sometimes these satellites are spinning in space, right? They don't just stay steady, they may be spinning. And because of that spinning, you have a phenomenon known as spin fading. And sometimes that can affect your reception and also transmission to the satellite. So that's an exam question. What is spin fading? Spin fading of a satellite signal is caused by the rotation of the satellite and its antennas. So while the satellite is in space, it is rotating, it is spinning, hopefully not out of control, but it is spinning. And because of that, you can have variation in the signal, and that's called spin fading. So I think that's it for our theory. We have our trusty slide, made a little adjustment just to show where the FM broadcast band is. So, it's always good to keep the slide handy as you study. Found it to be a very useful slide. Many students have reported that they refer to the slide quite a bit. So we are keeping this in the slide deck. But let us now go on to do our usual question pool review. That caters for all of the questions that we have covered the theory this evening. So we'll speed through all of these questions. Let's go. What type of amateur station simultaneously retransmits the signal of another amateur station on a different channel or channels? We know that to be a repeater station. What types of amateur stations can automatically retransmit the signals of other amateur stations? So we said those are repeater, auxiliary, and space stations. Those are automatic stations. Which of the following describes a linked repeater network? We said that a network of repeaters in which signals received by one repeater are transmitted by all the repeaters in the network. Continuing. What is a common repeater frequency offset in the 2-meter band? So we need to know and learn this. For the 2-meter band, it's plus or minus 600 kilohertz. Similar question, but this time for the UHF band or the 70 centimeter. What is a common repeater frequency offset in the 70 centimeter band? Plus or minus 5 megahertz. And remember what the repeater offset is? It's a difference between the transmit and receive frequency of the repeater as well as your radio. What term describes the use of a sub-audible tone transmitted along with normal voice audio to open the squelch of a receiver? Well, we call that sub-audible tone CTCSS. Okay. Which of the following could be the reason you are unable to access a repeater whose output you can hear? Well, if our transceiver offset is wrong or improper, you're using the wrong CTCSS tone, or you're using the wrong DCS code. All of those are reasons that can cause your repeater to be inaccessible to you. All right. How is a VHF UHF transceiver's reverse function used? Well, when we press that button, it is to allow us to listen on a repeater's input frequency. Reverse function. What would you cause, or I say again, what would cause your FM transmission audio to be distorted on voice speak? So remember we talked about that. Over deviating, we are speaking too loudly or overdriving. So that's the answer. You are talking too loudly. Next question in the question pool. What is an appropriate way to call another station on a repeater if you know the other station's call sign? So we say the station's call sign, then identify with your call sign. Okay. So remember we went Juliet 69 Delta Sierra, 9 Yankee 4 Romeo. Okay. All right. Continuing. Which of the following indicates that a station is listening on a repeater and looking for contact? So the station's call sign followed by the word monitoring. So 9 Yankee 4 Romeo monitoring. Continuing. What term describes an amateur station that is transmitting and receiving on the same frequency? Is it duplex? No, duplex would be repeat operation. It is simplex. All right. Why are simplex channels designated in the UHF VHF band plans? It is so that stations within range of each other can communicate without tying up a repeater. Okay, next one. What is the national calling frequency for FM simplex operation in the 2 meter band? So, first of all, it's the 2 meter band. The 2 meter band is what? The 144 megahertz band, right? So the answer cannot be 432 or 446 right away, right? It's got to be one of these. But the correct frequency for the calling frequency on the 2 meter band is 146.520 megahertz. What is the meaning of the procedural signal CQ? Well, it means calling any station. What should you do before calling CQ? Well, you should do all of these. Listen first to be sure that no one else is using the frequency. Ask if the frequency is in use and make sure you are authorized to use that frequency. So all of these choices are correct. How should you respond to a station calling CQ? Well, you transmit the other station's call sign followed by your call sign. Okay, so once you follow those protocols, you will sound quite professional as an amateur radio operator. Okay, which of the following is required when making on-the-air test transmissions? Well, make sure to identify the transmitting station. That's the call sign. Next question in the question pool. Which Q signal indicates that you are receiving interference from other stations? That Q code is QRM. Which Q signal indicates that you are changing frequency? That is QSY. Next question. What is a band plan beyond the privileges established by the FCC? It is a voluntary guide for using different modes or activities within an amateur band. All right, which of the following applies when two stations transmitting on the same frequency interfere with each other? So, courtesy is contagious. So the stations should negotiate continued use of the frequency. In other words, be nice, talk to each other, work it out. What is the Amateur Radio Emergency Service? That's ARES. What is ARES? It's a group of licensed amateurs who have voluntarily registered their qualifications and equipment for communications duty in the public service. What is the Radio Amateur Civil Emergency Service, or RACES? Well, it's a radio service using amateur frequencies for emergency management or civil defense communications. It's also a radio service using amateur stations for emergency management or civil defense communications. And it is also an emergency service using amateur operators certified by a civil defense organization as being enrolled in that organization. So all of those choices are correct. Describe what RACES. Another question on RACES. What is RACES? It's an FCC Part 97 amateur radio service for civil defense communications during national emergencies. Next question in the question pool. Which of the following are typical duties of a net control station? Well, they call the net to order and direct communications between stations checking in. Okay, moving right along. Which of the following is standard practice when you participate in a net? So unless you are reporting an emergency, transmit only when directed by the net control station. In other words, when they call for additional check-ins or when they call you back for reports, All right. What does the term traffic refer to in net operations? Traffic refers to messages exchanged by net stations. That's what traffic is. Do you have any traffic to pass? Okay. Which of the following is a characteristic of good traffic handling? Well, passing messages exactly as received. It's a good characteristic. You want to corrupt the message. Next question in question pool. What technique is used to ensure that voice messages containing unusual words are received correctly? So the technique is you spell the words using a standard phonetic alphabet. Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Echo, Foxtrot, etc. What information is contained in the preamble of a formal traffic message? Right? Remember, we also call that the header. Well, it's information that is needed to track the message. Next question. What is meant by check in a radiogram header? It means the number of words or word equivalents in the text portion of the message. Right. Next question. When do FCC rules not apply to the operation of an amateur radio station? Remember we said that's a trick question. The answer is FCC rules always apply. Okay, next up. Are amateur station control operators ever permitted to operate outside the frequency privilege of their license class? Yes, but only in situations involving the immediate safety of human life or protection of property. Okay, couple more questions. Which amateurs may contact the International Space Station on VHF bands? Any amateur holding a technician class or higher license. So when you become licensed, you will be able to use a space station such as the ISS and communicate. Yes, folks, pretty exciting to do. Okay, what is meant by the statement that a satellite is operating in UV mode? It means that the satellite uplink is in the 70 centimeter, which is the UHF band, and the downlink is in the 2 meter band, which is the VHF band. That's how you get the U and the V from. The U stands for UHF, the V stands for VHF. Okay. What mode of transmission is commonly used by amateur radio satellites? Well, SSB, FM, CW, and data are all correct. What is the impact of using excessive effective radiated power on a satellite uplink? So let's dissect that. They say, what impact? In other words, what happens? Using what? Excessive effective radiated power. In other words, if you're using too much power on a satellite uplink, you're transmitting with a large or heavy or strong power, right? Well, you can end up blocking access by other users. Not nice. All right, which of the following is a way to determine whether your satellite uplink power is neither too low nor too high? Well, it's if your signal strength on the downlink should be about the same as the beacon. Next question, what is a LEO satellite? It's a satellite in low Earth orbit. All right. What is a satellite beacon? It's a transmission from a satellite that contains status information. What telemetry information is typically transmitted by a satellite beacon or satellite beacons? It's health and status of the satellite. Who may receive telemetry from a space station? Anyone. Okay. Which of the following are provided by satellite tracking programs or software? Well, you get maps showing the real-time position of a satellite track over Earth. You get the time, the azimuth, and the elevation of the start, maximum altitude, and the end of a pass. You also get the apparent frequency of the satellite transmission, including effects of Doppler shift. All of these you get from the satellite tracking software. Which of the following are inputs to a satellite tracking program? Well, we said it must have the capillary elements. All right. Next one. What is Doppler shift in reference to satellite communications? It is an observed change in signal frequency caused by the relative motion between the satellite and the Earth. Remember, we gave the example of the ambulance moving relative to us. Changes in pitch. Same thing happens with a satellite signal. And our last question in the question pool for this evening is what causes spin fading of satellite signals? It's the rotation of the satellite and its antennas. So as it spins in space, that causes spin fading. So folks, let's just return quickly to our slide deck because we have a couple of things that's important to announce. Actually, one major announcement. All right, so we have been dealing with pages 90 to 101 of the No Nonsense Guide. So of course, any questions, feel free to send an email or WhatsApp. We'll try our best to get to it. All right, so we have been mentioning for a couple of weeks that the volunteer examiners will be scheduling in-person exam in Trinidad and Tobago shortly. So on your screen, we have the date of the exam. It's Saturday, the 19th of August, 2023. Time is 10 a.m. and the venue will be at TAT, the Telecommunications Authority of Trinidad and Tobago. That's located in Barataria. So we have the link to the registration at the bottom, right? You'll get this in your slide deck, so you can click on it. Please note that there's a deadline to register for the exam, and that's the Monday before the exam. That's Monday, the 14th of August. So the exam's on the 19th. But the deadline to register or fill out this form is the 14th of August. We also would like to ask that you please carefully read and follow all instructions in the registration form. Your failure to do so may mean that when you show up on the exam date, that you may be disappointed. So please read carefully, try to understand, ask any questions of the volunteer examiner. The contact information is on the sheet on this link. Ask any questions, but please follow to a T what is asked. They will tell you that you have to register for the FRN. We gave that information in session number 1. We will also run through it again on our last session. You must have your FRN number when you go to the exam. If you don't, you may not be permitted to take the exam, right? So please read very carefully and try to follow those directions. Muy importante. All right. So folks, thank you very much also for the extra time. We are doing quite well in terms of the syllabus. As a matter of fact, based on the pace that we have run, we are just a little bit ahead of schedule, which is good. So thank you so much for your time. Everyone, continue to be safe. Take good care. Do have a good night and see you in our next session.